my pleasure really to introduce our speaker for today, somebody whose incredible dedication to troubled and troubling children has changed many, many thousands of lives across the country. Pat Lawler, is the CEO of Memphis-based Youth Villages. And Pat has a remarkable story to share with us today. And he will not feature himself as the main character in the story, but this is a story that could not have unfolded without Pat. A little bit about his background. At the tender age of 24, Pat was thrust into an impossible situation. He was asked to save a failing residential treatment center that had already chewed up and spit out 2 directors in the same year. And Pat was successful. He was able to save Dogwood Villages by working endlessly, surviving on a few hours of sleep a night, by working weekends and evenings, and even, as I understand it, mowing the lawn to make that happen. In 1986, Youth Villages was founded through the merger of Dogwood Villages and Memphis Boys Town. And today, Youth Villages is recognized as a model program with a national presence. They are located throughout 11 states and the District of Columbia. Pat's leadership has been instrumental in the program's growth and proven outcomes. And he's been recognized by U.S. News and World Report and by the White House as one of America's top leaders. Now, there's no question that Pat is a proven business leader and that he can manage a vast enterprise and raise millions of dollars in support of the work of Youth Villages. However, Pat's passion is really driven by a deep and genuine love for troubled kids. When Youth Villages opened its first foster care program, Pat and his wife opened their doors to become a foster family for their first child. There are lots of stories of Pat's personal generosity and kindness toward children, helping some with financial and emotional support all the way through college, helping others overcome desperate poverty through years of support and encouragement. Pat really leads from the heart. He walks the talk, and it's a pleasure to have him here with us today and an honor. We thank you, Pat, and welcome you.
As you will hear in a minute, I'm from South Cleveland. My wife and a group of friends visited Ireland years ago. We met a little 12-year-old girl, and she was one of the little tours on one of the tours we had taken over there. And after a few minutes, after talking with us, she started laughing, and she said, "Why are you talking like Huckleberry Finn?" My friends still refer to me as Huck. So, 32 years ago, I became the 3rd executive director of a small residential program you heard Frank mentioned called Dogwood Village. We had 25 young people and 9 staff. We were struggling financially, and the program was pretty much out of control. We tried our best, but we still struggled. We finally grew to 40 kids. One of the problems when you start a new program is they send you all the toughest and most challenging kids in your community because you're the new guy on the block, and longer, more established programs can be a little more selective, but we couldn't. Fortunately, along the way, I met a man named Bob Slagel in 1983, and Bob invited me to a conference in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in the summer of 1994 called the American Re-Education Association National Conference. And there I met Frank, I met Rico Pilata, I met Mary Lynn and Bob Cantrell, Tom and Claudia Valor, Clark Luster, a lot of just wonderful people that were really focused on sharing and strengthening their organizations by following a man's teachings named Nicholas Hobbs. And the principles are over here to the right, and I'm sure some of you heard of Nick Hobbs and his work. But really the focus is more on strengthening children and families rather than punishing them for their bad behaviors. But as a struggling organization, we were just barely surviving. But these men and women's organizations leading this movement of re-ed, they were not just surviving, they were succeeding and had bright visions of the future. And at Youth Villages, at the time called Dogwood Village, we were in the business really of raising other people's children. We believed the communities were bad, the schools were bad, the families were bad. We were going to raise these young people in this beautiful residential program we had and send them out to be successful. We knew we were successful. We had kids on the waiting list. People were lauding our success with our program. And even another residential program in 1986 closed. And they came to us and said, "Look, you're the most recognized program in town. We need your help." So we merged the 2 organizations together, creating Youth Villages, 2 residential programs for boys and girls. Each campus had 40 young people each. We had about 50 staff. And we just knew that was going to be our future, building these young people to be strong young adults to go out and change the world. Well, in the late 80s, I would start bumping into kids and families that had been in our program, and because we were such a small program, I knew all of them. And I'd say, well, how's Margaret? And they'd say, oh, you haven't heard. I go, what do you mean? They go, well, she had a baby. And Margaret was 14. I go, well, I'd meet other family members. How's Tommy? Oh, you haven't heard. He ran away. And more I get stories like that. Kids were running away. Kids were failing in school. Kids were having children at a very young age. Kids were abusing drugs. Had a couple children that had committed suicide. And this is very hard work caring for emotionally troubled children. And so we decided to start doing a little research. So we started every year calling all the kids that had been there the year before. Nothing scientific, just one phone call. How are your son doing? How's your brother doing? How's your grandson doing? And what we found was kind of troubling because only about half the responses were very favorable. And while I'm attending these biannual conferences with my friends with the area and going to periodic quarterly board meetings, I would hear about their program's dramatic success here in Cleveland and wondering why we were struggling so mightily. And finally, in 1993, we met a man named Scott Hingler who had developed a model called multisystemic therapy. I remember my first meeting with Scott. I said, well, tell me about the foundation of this MST model you've created. And he started telling me about his relationship and his research of a man named Nicholas Hobbs in Riyadh. So we felt very comfortable that we were talking the same language. But the whole idea behind MST was instead of removing children from their families and putting them into a residential or foster home, was to really go into the community and work with the child in the home. Because the three primary predictors of kids that get into trouble are there's a lot of conflict in the family. People aren't getting along. There's no schedules. There's no support. There's a lot of challenging relationships, sometimes many people living in the family. And secondly, is their performance at school is very poor. Maybe they're in the wrong classroom. Maybe they're in trouble. Maybe they're skipping school. Maybe they're not going to school. Maybe they've been expelled or suspended from school. And then third, and the most important, is the peer group relationships. And kids, running around with their own group of kids. Well, when we remove kids and put in our residual programs, we can control all that. But really, what we found was when kids were going back home, that was a real problem. And we found that kids were more a reflection of who they were with and what they were doing. And in our residual program, we could control that. Well, the whole idea of MST was to keep kids in the community, have a counselor working with only 4 or 5 families, working with that family for 4 to 6 months, being in that home at least 3 times a week, sometimes more if there's crisis, being on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, working with the family, the peer group, and the school to help improve performance. We decided to start the program in 1994. We couldn't get the government to fund us. They thought it was crazy. We got a small grant from a foundation. By 1995, we had some progress and were able to convince the state to give us some funding, and we basically decided to start our organization totally over. We rewrote every job description, every policy and procedure, and even added a value and said that we believe children are raised best by their families. In later years, we expanded this MST model because the multisystemic therapy model was primarily more focused for kids in the juvenile justice system, and more of the young people we serve were part of the mental health and child welfare system. So we really developed our own model. We have several programs, more than our intensive in-home program. We still provide residential treatment for the kids with the most serious needs, but we try to keep those in the program or for a short period of time and try to get them back home with their families as quickly as possible. We also provide therapeutic foster care. But one of the programs we're growing the most is our transitional living program for young people aging out of the foster care system. It's tragic what happens to more than 30,000 kids a year that age out of the foster care system pretty much on their own with no services and support. And unfortunately, the government doesn't provide that as well, so we're having to raise most of that money. Today we are serving, this year we'll serve over 19,000 young people, over 2,600 staff. You heard about the approach at the end we use called evidentiary family restoration. And really our progress and our program's progress over the years is really directly related to that. And it really is centered around 4 key tenets. And the first is really the focus on treating children and families together. And those in the room who know anything about Nick Hobbs' work said that 50 years ago, that children should not be treated in isolation, but the family should be part of that process. And we really believe that early days we thought families were the real problem, but they're truly the solution to the problem. Secondly, measuring long-term outcomes. So often we felt that a good experience would translate into a good life. That just doesn't happen, and it's so important that our program has the systems in place, the process in place to support long-term outcomes. We measure all of our kids for 2 years at 6, 12, and 24 months. We have a full-time group of 16 researchers that track outcomes, and we're constantly assessing the outcomes we're getting and the service they're receiving. So which kids are doing better than others based on their presenting problems or diagnosis, what service they're receiving, then which kids are failing in the program, and why are they failing, and what can we do to help enhance their programs to have better outcomes. But we also look at the waiting list. This is something that so often we neglect. The waiting list should be the most important group of kids, the kids trying to get our services and making sure that we have services to meet their needs as well. Being sustainable in the community. You know, Nick also talked about how important communities were for children, and we have to work with the schools, we have to work with the Boys Club, the Girl Scouts, we have to work with the churches, the communities to make sure our work continues on. And most of our work in the home is not just supporting the family, it's building a strong support system around the family that will be there when our services are complete. And we also use highly intensive protocols. You heard it, 7 days a week we're on call, 24 hours a day. We are there and available. We use a dozen evidence-based interventions, protocols, assessment tools, and models in our programs. And then lastly, you really provide accountability. And this is so often what people talk about, but can they really do it? We even had one of our values is, you know, we do what we say we do, and we think it's critical that we provide accountability to family and the funders as well. You know, Nick talks also often about trust between children and adults is essential. We also think that trust between providers and families and funders is also essential. My friend Mario Marino gave a speech a couple weeks ago. He had kind of lit a fire, I think, at the City Club of Cleveland is what I heard. Pretty much wherever Mario goes, he lights a fire, and that's why we love him. But I love the name of his speech. It was relentless. I've got to start using that word more, because I think so much in our work and work with young people, you have to be relentless. But his comments were really about the relentless pursuit of results and favorable results. And one thing that I've been so impressed over the years at PEP is how they measure not just the data and the outcome performance of the teacher counselor and the young people while they're in the program, but also after they leave the program. You know, spending the day with Frank is like spending the day with the smartest science teacher I've ever been around. I mean, we talk about outcomes, we talk about research, we were talking about brain research, we were talking about a lot of the new trauma research. He was quoting books and quotes from the best scientists in our field of the day, looking ahead of how he can make and help make PEP a better organization. You know, we've been fortunate over the years. I didn't just have somebody take me under their wing. We've had a whole flock of PEP leadership take all of us under their wing. And I'm just so happy to see your success, Frank, and your team. But like communities being important for children and families, communities are critical to help organizations. And our organization wouldn't be where it was today without our support, and I know yours wouldn't either. But I just want to thank all of you for being here and for your support of PEP. Thank you.